2004, a wildlife researcher named Lawrence Anthony received an urgent call. A herd of wild elephants in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa, had been condemned to death. They were considered too dangerous, too traumatized, too unpredictable to be safely managed. Nobody wanted them. Nobody knew what to do with them. Anthony, who ran the Thula Thula private game reserve, agreed to take them despite warnings from colleagues that he was making a serious mistake. The elephants arrived terrified and aggressive. Within days, they broke through the reserve's electric fencing and escaped. Anthony tracked them on foot, speaking to them in low, calm tones, positioning himself between them and the rifles of rangers who were ready to shoot if the herd could not be contained. He did this repeatedly, for weeks, placing his body and his voice between these animals and their death until something shifted. The matriarch, a large female named Nana, began to settle. The herd began to tolerate his presence. Over months, they moved from terror to cautious acceptance to something that looked, to every observer who witnessed it, remarkably like trust. Anthony died in March 2012. He had not visited the elephants for over a year before his death. The herd was ranging freely across the reserve, far from his home. 12 hours after he died, Nana led the entire herd out of the bush and to the boundary of Anthony's house, where they stood in silence for 2 days before quietly returning to the wild. Nobody had called them. Nobody had fed them. Nobody knew how to explain it. His family stood watching through windows, unable to understand how the elephants had known. That story raises a question that sounds simple but reaches into some of the deepest and least understood territory in animal science. Do wild animals actually remember the humans who helped them? And if they do, what does that memory look like inside an animal mind? The honest starting point is distinguishing between what we know, what the evidence strongly suggests, and what remains genuinely uncertain. Because this topic sits at the intersection of neuroscience, animal behavior, and a deeply human tendency to project our own emotional experience onto other species. Both errors are possible. Dismissing animal memory entirely and over-romanticizing it into something it may not be. The science demands more precision than either extreme allows. Start with what is established beyond reasonable doubt. Animals have memory. This is not a philosophical question. It is a biological fact with clear neural mechanisms. The hippocampus, the brain structure most critical for forming and retrieving memories, exists across all vertebrate species. Fish have it. Reptiles have it. Birds have a functional equivalent. Mammals have it in its most developed form. Memory is not a uniquely human capacity. It is an ancient survival tool that evolution arrived at hundreds of millions of years ago and has been refining ever since. What varies between species is not whether memory exists, but what kind of memory, how detailed it is, how long it persists, and what emotional weight it carries. Elephants are the most documented case and the most compelling, so they deserve extended attention. The elephant brain is the largest of any land animal. Their temporal lobes, the regions associated with memory and emotional processing, are exceptionally developed. Researchers studying wild elephant herds have documented individual recognition across time gaps that would challenge many humans. Elephants recognize other elephants they have not encountered for over a decade based on vocalizations alone, responding differently to the calls of known individuals versus strangers with measurable physiological changes in stress hormones and behavioral alertness. They recognize human faces and voices with similar precision. A 2018 study published in Animal Cognition found that African elephants could distinguish between different human ethnic groups based on clothing, smell, and voice, showing heightened fear responses to groups historically associated with poaching or conflict, and relaxed responses to groups associated with peaceful coexistence. This discrimination persisted across time and required not just recognition, but the retrieval of contextual associations attached to that recognition. Karen McComb at the University of Sussex has spent decades studying elephant cognition and social memory. Her research demonstrates that elephants maintain detailed social knowledge of hundreds of individuals, tracking relationship histories, past conflicts, alliances, and what might be described as reputations across the full membership of their extended social networks. A matriarch does not just remember faces. She remembers what each face means, what history it carries, whether it represents safety or threat. What this means for humans humans who have interacted significantly with elephants is not difficult to extrapolate, though the research confirming it directly remains limited. The biological capacity for long-term individual recognition with associated emotional and contextual memory is clearly present. Whether it extends to the kind of cross-species bond that the Lawrence Anthony story implies is harder to prove and easier to sentimentalize. Dolphins present a different but equally striking case. In 2013, researchers at the University of Chicago published findings from a study on bottlenose dolphin social memory that produced numbers that stopped the scientific community. Dolphins tested for recognition of the signature whistles of former tankmates. Individuals they had lived alongside and then been separated from showed recognition responses after separations of up to 20 years. The lead researcher, Jason Bruck, noted that this represents the longest social memory ever demonstrated in a non-human animal, comparable in its duration to the longest human social memories tested under controlled conditions. For dolphins who have interacted with specific humans repeatedly, the implications are significant. Bottlenose dolphins in various locations around the world have developed ongoing voluntary relationships with specific human individuals, returning to the same spots to interact with the same people across years and decades. Researchers studying these interactions have documented that the dolphins distinguish between familiar humans and strangers with clear behavioral differences, approaching known individuals with relaxed curiosity and treating unfamiliar humans with caution or indifference. Whether this constitutes remembering being saved specifically, remembering a particular emotional context of rescue, is a harder question. The memory of the individual appears robust. The emotional coloring of that memory is more difficult to measure. Birds complicate the picture in a direction most people do not expect. Corvids, the family that includes crows, ravens, jays, and magpies, have brains that bear almost no structural resemblance to mammalian brains. They lack a neocortex, the layered structure that houses complex cognition in mammals. For most of the 20th century, this was taken as evidence that their cognitive abilities were necessarily limited. Then researchers actually tested them and found something that required a complete revision of assumptions about what brain structure is required for complex thought. John Marsluff at the University of Washington conducted a series of experiments in which researchers wore specific masks while trapping and banding crows, a procedure the crows found stressful. When those same masked individuals walked through the crow population's territory weeks, months, and eventually years later, the crows responded with targeted alarm calls, dive bombing, and aggressive mobbing behavior directed specifically at the mask associated with capture. Neutral masks worn by other researchers drew no response. The crows had not just remembered the face. They had taught it to their offspring and to neighboring crows who had never encountered the original masked researcher at all. The memory spread socially through the population, transmitted from individual to individual across generations, persisting in the community long after the original birds who formed the memory had died. The inverse has also been documented. Crows and ravens who have had positive repeated interactions with specific humans show preferential approach behavior toward those individuals, bringing objects to them, responding to their calls differently than to strangers, in some cases appearing to seek out their company. Whether this reflects something like affection or simply a learned association between a specific face and positive outcomes is a question the research cannot fully resolve. The behavior itself is not in dispute. The case of Christian the lion became one of the most widely shared wildlife stories of the 20th century precisely because it seemed to demonstrate something the rational mind resists accepting. In 1969, two Australians named John Rendell and Ace Berg purchased a lion cub from Harrods department store in London, where exotic animals were then legally sold. They raised him in their apartment and in the garden of a furniture shop for nearly a year before arranging for him to be rehabilitated into the wild in Kenya under the supervision of conservationist George Adamson. A year after Christian had been released into the wild and had formed his own pride, Rendell and Berg traveled to Kenya to visit him. Adamson warned them that Christian had fully reverted to wild behavior and might not recognize them. The reunion, filmed on a handheld camera, shows Christian approaching at a run and then rising on his hind legs to embrace both men repeatedly, rubbing his face against theirs with every behavioral marker of intense positive recognition. A year in the wild had not erased a year of close daily contact. The question of what exactly Christian remembered, whether he was retrieving a specific emotional memory of these specific individuals or responding to a complex combination of scent, voice, and visual recognition triggering a deeply positive associative state, cannot be answered from the footage. But the recognition itself, across a year of separation and complete immersion in wildlife, is documented. The The honest, scientific answer to whether wild animals remember the humans who saved them is layered and depends on the species, the duration and nature of the original contact, the type of memory being asked about, and what we mean by remember. The capacity for long-term individual recognition is established across multiple species. Elephants, dolphins, corvids, great apes, and several other species have demonstrated it under controlled conditions. The capacity for emotionally colored memory, for associating a specific individual with safety, comfort, or positive experience across extended time, is supported by behavioral evidence, even where the neural mechanisms are not fully mapped. What is harder to establish is whether animals experience something like gratitude in any sense that resembles the human emotion, whether they are not just recognizing a face and retrieving an associated positive state, but actually encoding a relational history that includes something like awareness of a debt or a bond. The research does not rule this out, but it cannot confirm it either. And the difference between a deeply positive learned association and something we would recognize as remembered gratitude may be smaller than it first appears, or it may be the most significant gap in the universe. We do not yet have the tools to know. What we do know is this: when Lawrence Anthony's elephants walked out of the bush and stood at his house for 2 days after his death, they were doing something that their biology equipped them to do, that their social memory made possible, and that their relationship with one specific human made meaningful. Whether we call it grief or recognition or loyalty, or simply the behavioral output of a memory system more sophisticated than we ever gave it credit for being, something real was happening in those elephant minds, something that connected a living herd to a man who was gone, across distance and time, in a way that nobody who witnessed it could explain, and nobody who hears about it can entirely dismiss. That is where the science leaves us, not with a clean answer, but with a deepened respect for the interior lives of the animals who share this planet with us, and a growing suspicion that the distance between their minds and ours is considerably shorter than we have spent most of history assuming.